The sermon text for today, the story of John the Baptizer's murder, is dreadful. If this was a movie, it'd be rated at least R. Yet it comes up in the lectionary every 3 years. And in the vein of true confessions, the last 2 times it came up, I punted. The last time I moved to the Old Testament text from Amos. I'm sure you recall my sermon about plumb bobs and walls. Something safe, something actually I might know a little bit about. With some trepidation, I have chosen to stay with the text this time. I apologize if you do not leave feeling up and happy about this text, but it's here in Mark for a purpose. As we learn, one of the things it does in the final line is it ultimately tells us a story of faithful resistance and courageous hope. So let's listen for God's message to us in Mark chapter 6, verses 14 through 29. King Herod heard of it, it being Jesus and his movement. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him. But others said, it is Elijah. And others said, it is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. But Herod heard it and he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. Then we have a flashback in time. For Herod himself had sent men to arrest John, bound him and put him in a prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And Herodias had a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to John. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his couriers and officers and leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guest, and the king said to the girl, Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it. And he swore to her, Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, What should I ask for? Her mother replied, The head of John the Baptizer. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptizer on a platter. The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guest, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier to the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, and put it in front of the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. The Bible includes a number of tales that include violence and death, and perhaps none are more graphic than this one. The Bible includes a number of tales that take us into courtrooms of immoral and unprincipled and self-absorbed leaders. Unlike some of those other stories, here there is no Esther or Daniel, no one to serve as a safety valve to prevent the ruler's stupidity from becoming deadly. No one saves the day. Nor is there a humorous element that allows the story to function as satire. This is a depiction of one very noxious person, Herod, with little impulse control, who holds power over all. Remember our word from 2 weeks ago? Intercalation? Very good. Amy got it. Well, here we go again. Mark will once again use the sandwich technique to help us put this story in context and give it extra meaning. To build the sandwich, Mark starts with two things happening. Last week we heard the exciting, upbeat account of commissioning of the disciples to go out in pairs on their first independent missions. Mark did pair that with a story of rejection of Jesus in his hometown. Then comes our reading for today is in the middle part of our sandwich. Timing is then after the hometown experience and sending the disciples, and before the disciples return and report back on their successful missions to close the sandwich. This center story, our reading today, also foreshadows Jesus' own death by the hands of a politician, though sympathetic, still a political figure. As an aside, we can observe that this story is the only one in Mark in which Jesus is not the primary subject. A little different. Mark structured this intercalated story after Jesus sent out his disciples to report the death of John the Baptist. That death is the centerpiece of this inner part of the story. Mark kind of hinted at John's death earlier in his text, but saved the full report for here. It was observed, if you choose to have a vision, it could be observed, if you choose to have a vision of Jesus' life and mission as disconnected from the socio-political affairs of his first century setting, if you had a vision of his life as light and joyful, you will have to somehow set this account of John's death aside. That would be hard to do, because Jesus' life is not disconnected from real life. If you accept the intercalation, Mark placed this dreadful account between highs of commissioning and return of the disciples for the explicit purpose of first implying its significance for the expansion of Jesus' mission, and second, the reality of how challenging the course of Jesus' mission would be. Mark does not directly disclose how Jesus responds to John's beheading, but it requires little effort to imagine his response. Remember, Jesus launches his public ministry in the aftermath of, and perhaps in direct response to, John's arrest. As it turns out, John prepares the way of the Lord in his death as well as in his life. As we say often, John the Baptist prepares the way. As Mark Skinner comments, if we're going to take seriously the villains in this story, we need to know who they are. So a little background. Start with King Herod. This is Herod Antipas, the son of the infamous Herod the Great, who died in 4 BC, who we tie back to the killing of all the children. Herod Antipas was whom the Romans had installed, ruled over 1/4 of the Roman Empire, including Galilee. His power was close to absolute. Absolute as long as he protected the Roman interest and did not overly antagonize his subjects. He could treat a low-status prisoner like John however he chooses. Herod had John under protective custody, apparently admired John, and enjoyed listening to him. But the story will turn. Then second, there's Herodias, Herod's wife. These names are just too similar, but we have to deal with it. She had previously divorced one of Herod Antipas's half-brothers to marry him. John had called them out, called this sinful, likely based on some passages from Leviticus. So wife Herodias gets upset and wanted John dead. Husband Herod compromises and puts him in jail. According to other sources outside the Bible, Herodias had a daughter by her previous marriage, and it is this young girl who is brought in to dance at Herod's birthday party. Dance before the high officials and leaders of Galilee. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled, and people have speculated and imagined things about this dancing. But all we really know is that she pleased Herod and his guests. Pleased him so much that the lustful fool promised her whatever she asked, up to half his kingdom. After consulting her mother, she sprang the trap on old Herod, saying, "I want you to give me John the Baptist's head on a platter, right this minute." Mark does not present the daughter as utterly innocent, although she is more of a pawn than anything else. Note that she did add to her mother's demand the ghoulish detail that John's head should be put on a platter. It is possible that Herod Antipas is exploiting his stepdaughter's sexuality to please a room full of men, and it is also possible that Herodias exploits the daughter further to compel her husband to execute John. No matter what is at work between the lines, it's just plain an ugly scene. Even though Herod had locked John up, maybe because he feared the movement, the text tells us he enjoyed conversing with him and was grieved at the prospect of having him beheaded. But don't get too sympathetic with Herod. He is hardly an outwitted dupe in this episode. His idiotic pledge to reward his stepdaughter with all up to half his kingdom reveals his arrogant and reckless nature. He is willing to use his unmitigated power in terrible ways. His lack of willingness to risk embarrassment out of regard for his oaths and for the guests makes him literally shameless. We can conclude that nothing matters to him more than looking after his own vanity. He will suppress whatever fear of God remains in him, squelch any spiritual curiosity he might have experienced, and snuff out the life of a prophet, all to protect and expand his own self-interest. I would ask you not to miss the final detail about John's disciples retrieving his body and giving it honorable burial. Consider the courage required to approach Herod's people to request the body, thereby declaring allegiance to John and the movement he led. It's certainly not the same by any stretch, but think in today's terms of the thousands of people who bravely showed up in March of 2024 to pay respects outside the church and cemetery in Moscow, where Alexei Navalny was mourned and laid to rest. If we're going to find a hint of good news surrounding John's death, it resides in his followers who refuse to be intimidated. As Mark Skinner summarizes, opposition to the reign of God takes a toll and has lasting consequences, but never has the last word. John foresaw a different world about to emerge. His disciples advanced that vision through their simple yet high-risk act of faithful resistance and courage. All right, I will grant at this point, you may be asking yourself, why? Why did he decide to preach on this gory passages with the political figures and prophets and no Jesus? Why didn't he punt again? You may ask, is he trying to be blatantly political? And if you're asking that question, I'd ask you and say that's just fine to ask, but I ask you instead to redirect that question from me to the Gospel of Mark. Rephrase that question first to, what is this story an account of events in which Jesus is not even present doing here at this juncture in Mark's Gospel? I know at a surface level, This is to set the stage for Jesus' execution, but there's more to it than that. Going to that next level, this story appears after several accounts of Jesus' stunning power and spiritual power over oppression and illness and death. We know this passage anticipates further stories that illuminate the weight and suffering that Jesus confronts. The scene emphasizes that anyone who needs convincing the cycle of misery and cruelty that ensnares the world. Despots ensnared the world in Jesus' day. Despots do come to power and do rule elements of our social political system. That is certainly continues to our day. Whether that be Russia's invasion of Ukraine or any one of the complicated messes in the Middle East or on the African continent or in Central and South America or even in our own country. Human society through despot rulers inflicts as much harm as demons and death. And in all cases, leaders' actions have widespread consequences. We recognize Herods still exist. Now, we individually or collectively do not always have the power to rein in the destructive potential of self-obsessed rulers with their toxic values or an unwillingness to listen to truth. But Herod Antipas and his household remind us that the innocent people will suffer from his actions. This story also reminds us that when we, the disciples of today, do not use the power available to us, innocent people will suffer. That leaves us with the disciples' question, our question: what do faithful resistance and courageous hope look like in our context? I ask you, think about it, pray about it, act upon it. What do faithful resistance and courageous hope look like for you, for me, for us? Amen.